Welcome to Second Look Education. I'm Amy.
And I'm Candace.
We're educators examining what's really happening in classrooms, policy, and teacher preparation. When joy is treated as optional, when professional judgment is replaced by scripts, and when compliance is mistaken for quality, both teachers and children pay the cost.
This podcast is our refusal to normalize that. Are we educating for compliance or for a future of educated critical thinkers?
That question drives everything we do. Each episode starts with a real moment from education, something observed, experienced, or encountered that made us pause and ask, what's actually going on here?
We dig into the complexity, we reject false binaries, and we refuse to pretend that what we're seeing is sustainable. This is Second Look Education.
Hi, and welcome back to Second Look Education Podcast. I'm Candace, and this is Amy, and today we're getting ready to take a second look at a moment that Amy is bringing to us. Amy, go ahead.
So again, I have a moment from my children. They're around a lot, so they inspire a lot of these moments. But this one, they were all coming home from school. It is an exciting time after school to tell us about their day. The last couple weeks, they've been talking about PE takeover. So have you heard of these like PE takeover days?
No, I have not.
Okay, so it's like our local special rec association that does like rec services for individuals with disabilities, and they have partnerships with park districts in the area. So they come to the schools and they do these PE takeovers, and they teach the kids about adaptive sports like wheelchair basketball. They were doing seated volleyball. And Shay was particularly excited to tell me about goal ball, which I had never heard of, but it's this like team sport after I looked into it, because she was telling me there's a ball with things inside of it, bells inside of it, so they defend their goals by listening for the ball. So it's for visually impaired athletes. And so the kids had the opportunities to play these sports with these athletes who have disabilities, right? And my fourth grader in particular was like amazed with the abilities of these athletes, because it was so hard for her and her friends to do these things. Like she really saw them as talented individuals being able to do these things, which just warmed my heart. And I think that learning about different abilities is really important. And they were learning about, it wasn't just my fourth grader, it was also at the elementary school with my second grader doing it, and at the middle school. So they all were, exposed to this organization. And
what a great organization.
Yeah. And so, beyond that, playing these games, they were learning about disabilities, and they were having conversations about respect. And I felt like it was really landing. They were getting something out of this. And so that was my first thought, right? It was like, this is great. This is awesome that they are learning about different children and being exposed to seeing them as having abilities versus disabilities, right?
Limitless.
Yeah. But the other like feeling I had was like, who isn't here? Who isn't in their schools? Because the reality is my children aren't educated with children who have significant disabilities, right? There's no children with Down syndrome. There's no visually impaired kids. There's no children in wheelchairs in their schools. And that's not uncommon in our area, at least as far as my experience has gone from, my time as a special educator. Like the kids with the most significant needs are housed at different schools. How about you?
I've seen there's been a variety. So I've seen where it's like full inclusion and everyone's together, but then I do see where there's more extreme cases that are separated. I find it interesting too, because I think back to like experiences when we were younger, and anyone that was identified as any type of special need, no matter where they fell on the needs category, we're all placed in one room at one time.
Yeah.
And then it became like, of course, tied to least restrictive environment. So I think, there's been this like battle of like what students should be in the classroom. But I've seen, again, depending on where I was at, I've seen a little bit of everything. But it's like, even in the private school sector, it's if you can't supply what the students need,
Right.
They have to go to the public school or be sent out because their funding is set up differently. So like there's a little bit of all of that.
There's
So I've
definitely
seen a variety. It often does leave it into like extreme needs the answer is specialized schooling, and mixed thoughts on that from like parents' perspective as well as the student's perspective, teacher perspective.
Yeah, it's a complex topic.
Yeah.
So I'm sitting here as a parent, and like I mentioned, I've taught special education and taught courses on special education, and so none of this is new, but it kind of comes back to this question: what does it mean to teach inclusion in a space that is already selectively inclusive, right? Because yes, we're going to expose you to these different types of children who have different abilities, but they're not actually in your school, right? And they're not navigating this school system in a fundamentally different way. So it brought up a lot of questions for me, and something I thought we could just look at, right? And talk about. I don't think there's like an answer or a solution to this, but just to have a conversation. So I think that this is what they're doing as far as this special rec coming and doing this PE takeover day. It's thoughtful work, right? The schools are partnering with these organizations to create these meaningful experiences for our kids. But I think in this way, inclusion is being positioned as something kids learn about rather than something that the environment is built for.
Oh, that is a powerful statement, because just that in itself, because how do you learn inclusion by not living it?
Yeah.
And they're not living it. They're being told about it. And is that inclusive at all?
It's kind of building empathy, right? We're building empathy, but for students, but we're not actually sharing space with them. So empathy is important, but it's not the same as access, right? So I think inclusion starts to move from something structural to something more conceptual. And that it's that conceptual inclusion that I'm like struggling with, because this conceptual inclusion, it's great. It really is. And I don't want to discount that, but it doesn't require the system itself to change. And, it always comes back to the system for me. So let's talk about what's really going on. So I think that this type of inclusion is event-based inclusion. It's scheduled, it's visible, it's intentional. I think it's meaningful, but design-based inclusion is much quieter. It's how our classrooms function every day. It's how our lessons are structured. It's how students access learning. I think that it's how school is designed, right? And with hallways and desks and all of that, it's really complex. It's how support shows up, right? Whether we have support services integrated into the classroom or the kids are pulled out for services, because inclusion isn't just this instructional, decision, it's organizational, right? It's bigger.
Right. So much bigger. Much bigger.
And then if inclusion needs a schedule, right? Like an event, then it's probably not structural.
Right.
So I thought maybe, because I love looking at why things came to be, I'd just talk a little bit about kind of the historical context, a little. So I think that it's important to note that we've actually come a really long way, legally speaking, right? Not that long ago, most students with disabilities were excluded from public schools entirely. And before 1975, okay, that's not much older than us. Most students, they were denied public education altogether. Right. And they were segregated in different classrooms or just kept at home. So then we get major legislation, right? 1975, starting with the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, and which then becomes IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And so for public schools, that's where we get the right to free and appropriate public education. So you don't have to stay at home, get individual education plans, and the idea of the least restrictive environment, which is something you mentioned earlier. So in theory, that means students should be educated alongside their peers as much as possible. Of course, that's subject to what the school and district can realistically be able to do. And all of that matters. And that's progress, big progress. But, again, we've expanded access in this way, but we haven't fully redesigned the system, right? We just moved the line of who gets included, right? Yes, more children get included in our general education classrooms because of a least restrictive environment stipulation, but there's still a line.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And that's the gap that is kind of sticking with me. So, like I said, in most schools, you see inclusion a lot more. I do have to say, even in the last, 10 years or so, as far as I don't see as many like self-contained classrooms in elementary buildings anymore. I think more schools, if they do house special education, it's definitely more inclusion based. I think that's progress, absolutely. Still, our children with significant disabilities aren't in our schools. At least that's been my experience. I taught special ed in a self-contained room, and we still didn't have kids with significant disabilities. Over the summer, I would teach at our local co-op. So a co-op takes care of the students with significant disabilities for multiple school districts, right? And so the schools, depending on, which co-op they belong to, then have to provide transportation for their kids to go to these schools. And so in the summer, I would teach for the co-op, and I would get to meet children from our school district who I'd never met, right? Because they didn't actually go to our schools. But if we could have, the services to provide them, they would have. Because of their complex needs, we weren't able to take care of them at our school. So the co-op did. And so it's, all of that is tied to capacity and staffing.
I was thinking too, I've had experiences with the co-op situation and that sort of thing. And it's interesting that we talk about that. We have created an entire system where students who need these additional services go to that co-op, rather than saying, what do we need to provide within our school to make it more inclusive? So that, I just, as you were saying that, I had never really thought about that, but it's still all tied, like this is the public education system, right? So it's still tied to those schools, and that's funds come through that district, right, to those co-ops. So then wouldn't it be wonderful to have it sustained within the schools so that it could be inclusive? Just a thought. I know it's a lot more complex than that, but we're still funneling the money into these co-ops. Just taking a look.
Yeah. So, like I said, I think we've expanded inclusion, but, we've also kind of defined where it becomes harder to sustain. We don't really talk about that line much, right? So that's kind of why I kind of brought this. And I do want to make sure that I don't want this to start to sound like a critique or to criticism, because that's not really the point. It's like a lot of people are doing a lot of thoughtful work.
Yes.
And I think schools are trying to make experiences better.
I think it's a very complicated topic.
Yeah.
I think I don't think even as you're speaking and I'm like ideas are coming into mind for me, I'm realizing like how complex this really is. But again, like what could we be doing better, right? Isn't that what we should all be doing as educators, focused on our students?
Inclusion is happening or not. It's happening, right? But it still has edges. I'm kind of naming that. So in the PE takeover stuff, my kids, they're learning empathy and perspective taking, and but again, they're not navigating the world with children with these complex needs. So inclusion stays at this conceptual level. It's something that we talk about and it's great, but if the kids don't have experiences with that difference, then are they building that muscle? Because practicing is different. It's slower. It requires you to adjust on a daily basis and not just a one-time, one and done, exposure.
And and you might be getting into this in a while, but like even the support, the staff support, the teacher training, the teacher supports, because we know from our pre-service information and working with the schools that even just special education within the classroom has increased, right? So teachers are being required more of these skills. And I know we're talking about more extreme cases, but at the same time, it's happening everywhere. So how, where are these teacher supports coming in?
Yeah. And I think that's kind of where I wanted to go next, is this teacher preparation work, because we teach about differentiation and assessment, inclusive practice. And then they enter classrooms and they get in there and there's all these ranges of needs, interests and languages and academic levels. And so it's like, it's already complex. And then to even think about what can exist on top of that, we would definitely need a level of redesign in the structures and systems to support that. And some teachers are unprepared for that, overwhelmed by that. Some and the idea of like a general education teacher is not trained as a special education teacher.
Right. I mean, what do they get, 1 or 2 classes?
Right. They're different
And then we talk about them, but to actually live and give the greatest supports, it's not enough.
No. Sometimes we're asking Jenna teachers to take on responsibilities that.
And it's not that they don't want to, it's that they really, and I'm going to make an assumption and a generalization, but in general, teachers want the best for all of their students. And so if they have a student that they feel like they can't help, that then leads to feelings of hopelessness, especially if they've asked for help and they're not getting it, they want the best for their entire class.
Yeah.
And it feels really hopeless. Like, I can't help this child because I really don't know what to do. And you can research all day, but it's nothing like learning, how to apply these things.
And I think that's where the system piece really matters.
Mm-hmm.
Inclusion was never meant to be one teacher taking it all on.
Right. Exactly.
It's meant to be supported through special education teachers and service providers and co-teaching models and specialists.
Well, and the co-teaching models, that's a whole nother topic. I won't go into that right now, but like, what is the co-teaching model? Is it where this teacher only comes for half a day and then the general education teacher supports the students through the rest of the day? Because is that truly co-teaching, right? So what are we actually seeing?
Yeah, so that's what I was going to mention is when those supports are limited, right? Or stretched thin or not structurally built in, then it all collapses back on that classroom teacher. And I can think about time, because I co-taught in a couple different ways and had aides, one-on-ones and classroom aides and all of, different types of support in my, classroom. But like when you rely on those people and then something comes up and they're pulled or they're not there, it falls apart and it comes back to you as the classroom teacher. And that's challenging. I think it's not that teachers don't want to support students.
Oh,
right?
Absolutely not. I think it's overwhelming. It's a lot. I mean, teachers already wear so many hats and are trying to do so many things. So no, I don't think that's the message at all.
No, it's kind of like we've blurred the line between supporting all of our learners and then expecting that one teacher to carry it all out. We need to build systems and to have these collaborations in place to be successful, and that's a lot of work. So have you seen co-teaching actually work?
I have at the high school level, I've seen it work, because the teachers are in those rooms during that teaching period and they work really well together. And so I've seen that in practice. But in terms of younger levels, where I've seen it done, it is, one, it matters how well the two work together, right? And any other support servers that come into the room. And two, if the system is prepared for, is this person being pulled all over, or is this teacher the co-teacher with the special education background and this being their expertise, how often are they able to get to the room? Because I've heard of classrooms, a younger grade, this particular teacher shared, very good teacher, loves her kids. And this is what I'm talking about with this, like wanting to do their best. And they'd only get the co-teacher for half the day. And so the first half of the day, they're trying all these things. And then also the second half of the day, whether it's a student with a label of special education of some sort or not, younger children at the second half of the day, it's when we're starting to fade out anyway. So it was this struggle for her. And again, it wasn't anything against her co-teacher. Her co-teacher is just being pulled, so like everyone involved, it was not as supportive as it could have been. And that's with an incredible experienced teacher in the room, so I think we have a long way to go on using those models and applying. But again, what is the system doing to support those situations?
Yeah. And I don't think there's a clean solution.
No.
I said at the outset, I don't think it's about deciding whether schools are doing things right or wrong or well or not well.
Well, don't you think when inclusion first came through, I know a few districts that are like, okay, all the students will be all put together and yes, they should be able to be, but like, it's anytime we swing this pendulum, right? So we like all of a sudden, okay, we had them separate. All the students with any type of services were all placed in this room, right? And then, oh no, we changed it. Now it's inclusion. And we went all the way to the other side and we said, everyone is included. Everyone should be together. But then we didn't give any preparation. And we thought it would be this beautiful thing in these schools, but it's not if it does harm to the children because they're not getting the services they need. The teachers are overwhelmed, the students in the class, like it's just this whole series. So, it's finding that middle ground of like, how do we build a system that can support this instead of rushing to check a box?
Yeah, the systems design
Yeah.
is very important in this
Yeah.
conversation. But I think that a couple things, is of course just noticing. So like noticing, like when we hear inclusion being talked about in schools or in programs, is like paying attention to who they're actually talking about and who they're not talking about. Because noticing that like helps you start seeing things differently, right? You start to realize that inclusion isn't absent, it just has these edges. Maybe underneath all of this is moving from thinking about inclusion as this add-on to something we design from the beginning. So how can we design our classrooms, if that's the locus of control, right, that we have, is how can we design this classroom for these children who are here to be inclusive of all of their needs as much as we can, because it can't just show up as these activities or a day, right?
That's not what inclusion means. That's a separate thing. Educate, you know what I mean? That's a separate thing saying this is what it could be like if we did this regularly, right? And I think too, as you're talking, I'm thinking about parents that I know that knew how to use their voice and advocate for their children in these inclusive environments versus the parents that don't. And if you know how to use your voice and fight for these things, it's a constant battle. I have a very dear friend who is just a huge fighter, and she advocated for her child from start to college, and her child's highly successful, and just a magnificent example of inclusion, but she had to do a ton of work. I mean, at all different levels, and push back on the school and question the system, and she had the ability to do that. Not that whether you have the ability or not, you should have to, but she had the ability. She knew where to go. She knew who to speak to. And a lot of people don't have advocates like that, or they don't know how to even connect with people and know that there are resources and people that will speak for you that you can have help from. But at the same time, it's exhausting. You already have a child that you're trying to support in all these different ways, depending on the circumstances and what they've gone through. And then now you're fighting just for them to be in an inclusive environment and get what they need, and figure out how to navigate that too. So, it's also looking at the system from like the emotional perspective of the parents who are advocating, the teachers who don't know how to advocate, and this entire system that shouldn't be so complicated, but it's because of this like rush. And instead of us stepping back and looking at and saying like, what does this need to look like?
Right, the design is important. Yeah, starting from the ground up rather than trying to add it in. It can't be added in. So, I'd like to do this like, well, what do you do with this information, right? So as a parent, like for myself, I don't think it's about asking big questions, complex questions about inclusion and what that means, especially
Not yet.
for younger kids.
By the time your kids get to high school, we'll be exploring all of these topics.
Yeah, I think it's how we talk about difference in everyday moments. So like at the park, or when you're walking into a building or in a parking lot, right? You notice the ramp, or you see the adaptive swing, or you pass someone using a wheelchair, right? It's like we can name it simply and casually, and that it's just part of life, and that things like that swing is designed so more kids can use it, or that ramp helps a lot of people move in different ways. It doesn't have to be a lesson, and I don't think it should be a lesson. It's just part of how the world works. And so I think when we do that, when we start noticing these things and helping our kids see them, it's that they can understand that spaces are designed, and that they can be designed in ways that include more people or not, right? So like, when we talk about, seeing ramps at places, and, we talk about, oh, that's a weird ramp, how it has to turn and go up. And then we talk about why it's there, right? And then we'll go to another place and they'll say, where's the ramp? How would a person with a wheelchair get in, And so they start seeing that as we
start to notice when we take the time to make it a priority. especially depending on our positionality in the world and where our perspective lies. When we take the time to realize our position in the world and the many roles we play, but we become aware of other people's position, then we're able to say, oh, what's missing? Who wouldn't have access to this? Oh, this would be really tricky for someone who, and start, having those conversations.
Yeah. And kids notice everything about their environments, right? They're naturally curious and want to learn why things are the way they are. So there's opportunities everywhere to do this.
Absolutely.
One of the things that when I was thinking about this came to mind is when the kids were real little and, they'd be on like tricycles or like scooters and stuff, and I'd be like with a stroller and they'd go ahead of me. And so their stopping point was that tactile paving at the end of a sidewalk so that people who are visually impaired know that they're coming to an intersection or they're leaving sidewalk, And so that small design for people who are visually impaired became a really important part of our lives. So we're able to use these universally designed adaptations or to the world around us to everybody's advantage. So what makes them universal? Yes, they're designed for this particular group of people, but all of us.
Well, and just so our listeners know, it's actually called Universal Design Learning, and so it's UDL. And if you look it up, it talks about the different ways that we make those designs and make those changes in education, but just thinking about things from a perspective of people too.
Yeah, because overall, this whole parent conversation, I think kids don't need us to turn difference into a lesson. They need us to treat it like it belongs.
Yeah.
Right? To show them, this is for
belonging, inclusion, being included.
Yeah. I think that, when our kids bring home these ideas like mine did about this inclusion thing, it was a time for me to like ask questions and help them be curious about it and not to like quiz them or make it something that it didn't need to be, just to listen and notice what feels normal to them and what still feels kind of separate, and help them see their environment is designed, for individuals, for all different types of individuals.
I mean, that's an equity lens, right? Taking that equity lens.
Okay, so I like to do this like for teachers. So thinking about first our classrooms, like I kind of mentioned, how can we design our space to be as inclusive as possible? We talk about differentiation all the time. We can differentiate, ability and readiness and, linguistics and the way students engage and participate and regulate. Those are all parts of inclusion. And it's already there. So what are you doing that's already there? It's your awareness. But beyond that, I think there's a bigger picture awareness that is like, who isn't in your classroom? Who isn't in your grade level or who isn't at your school? And wondering about that. Right? So where are those students learning? What does that setting look like? How do they have access to general education or
Well, and I think it's important to note too that some parents do choose those alternative environments. Some do not, but there are some that choose like specialty schools for their children so they can feel naturally included, and they've created an environment. Because I don't want to make it sound like
it's bad. It's not bad.
No, not even bad. I don't want to use the word bad, but I want to make it sound like,
a lesson.
Everybody's being forced to do it this way. Some parents really do choose because they're like, it's a specialty school. And again, that does speak to that they had the opportunity for those schools, but that is something just to note, like some parents do choose these environments.
Right.
And it's because the system they know isn't really designed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. We don't have the supports for a therapeutic day school in our public schools usually, So
hopefully the ending word of that is yet, right?
Yeah. But depending on a teacher's role, it probably shows up a little differently, right? If you're the general education teacher, you might be looking more at like, who's not here, or how can I open my classroom in different ways to collaboration with other teachers, things like that. And then if you're the special ed teacher, you're often like moving between spaces and you're thinking about how can your kids access, different spaces in the school or other schools or a community too, right?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be just in school. So advocacy is definitely an element to this, but connecting. So connecting between, you as the gen ed teacher or the special ed teacher and who you can communicate with and build relationships with to then support your students is really important, because like we mentioned, inclusion depends on collaboration. It's not meant to be held by one person.
Right. Absolutely.
And when it does, that's when it breaks down. That's when it's like really hard, and it doesn't work for the teachers or the children. No. We can't ignore the limits of the system. Like this is like, there are limits, but they're not fixed.
Right.
Like we can, see what kind of space we can negotiate within the limits. And when we make our classrooms more flexible, we model that for our children, right?
Absolutely.
Our students, and that's what we need. We need to help them become aware of who's missing, what it would look like to make room for them. Inclusion isn't just about how we teach the students in front of us. It's also about noticing the students who aren't there. And to bring this back to the beginning, I'm really, really glad my kids are having these PE takeover days and these experiences. And I really do mean that, but I don't want inclusion to be this thing that they visit, this once in a while thing. I want it to be something that they live alongside.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what inclusion is. Right? Thank you for joining us today and exploring Amy's moment and taking a second look.
See you next time.